Hello, welcome to the First Christian Church of Great Bend, Kansas Friendship Sunday School class online edition. My name is Lane Moore. If you watched our first lesson and you are back for number 2, I applaud your perseverance. It was a horrifying experience for me to watch myself for 23 minutes. I did not realize how hickish I sounded, but I guess it goes with the Central Kansas territory. And I guess after 69 years, you and I will have to embrace my hickishness, my redneckedness, because it's probably not going to change. So let's get started. I did shave. I did put on a collared shirt, which is black, as you can see, which I'm told is slimming because the camera adds 10 pounds. That seemed like a good idea. The story that we're going to talk about today, and if you saw last week, you know that was David and Goliath, and we will be talking about Old Testament stories that inspire during difficult times. All these stories take place during a difficult time for the Jewish people, and since we are in some difficult times today, I think it's worthwhile to revisit those. So this is the story of Esther, found in the book of Esther, one of 2 books named after women in the Bible. It is a mixture of an Alfred Hitchcock movie, an old Henry story. That's O, not old, O. Henry. And if you are old, like me, you read old Henry stories in school. And you probably read The Gift of the Magi and Ransom of Red Chief, and those stories had ironic twist of fate type endings. And you'll find that in this story. Throw in a season of The Bachelor, and you've got the story of Queen Esther. So it's found, as I said, in the book of Esther. It takes place 479 years before Jesus was born. It's approximately 600 years after the story of last week, David and Goliath. And it's approximately 1,000 years after the Jewish people left Egypt, after Moses led the Jewish people out of Egypt in the Exodus, crossing the Red Sea. So now the Jews are living in Persia, and Persia is like modern day Iran and Iraq. And 100 years prior to the time of this story, the Babylonians conquered Israel. They came in, conquered the Jewish people, drug them, sacked the temple, drug them out of Israel, took them back to Babylon, the youngest and the brightest, and assimilated them into their culture. And that's where we get the stories of Daniel in the lion's den, and Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego, and the writing on the wall. Those all came from Babylonia. Then the Persians conquer Babylonia, and that's what's going on now. The Persians are in power, and that's what we've got for today's story. Now, let me tell you about King Xerxes is the king of Persia. And the Jews had great freedom during this time in Persia. They were able to have their own business. They were prosperous. 60 years prior to this time, when the Persians conquered the Babylonians, the Jews were allowed to go back to Jerusalem if they chose. And it was a long journey. It was a long, hard journey. The Jews had been living in Persia for 60 years. A lot of them, this was the only home they knew. So some went back to Jerusalem, some stayed in Persia. And Esther's family stayed in Persia. Now, Esther becomes the queen of Persia, and this is how that happened. Persian kings, they collected wives a lot like art lovers collect paintings. And Xerxes, king at the time, he had a lot of wives. But he only had one queen, I'm sorry. And her name was Vashti. Well, Vashti loses her job as queen, and this is what happened. Xerxes had a big, like a 6 month long party, and he called all his military leaders into his palace in Susa, and he wanted to show off all of his wealth. The reason he's getting ready to invade Greece. It's a big morale boost for leaders and troops to know the king has plenty of money to carry on this campaign. They're not going to get in the middle of it and run out of cash. So that's what Xerxes is promoting. He's showing them that he can fund this campaign. So he shows off his wealth for 6 months. At the end of 6 months, he has a 7 day long party. And let me read that to you. And this is out of chapter 1, Esther, verse 8. By the king's command, each guest was allowed to drink in his own way, for the king instructed all the wine stewards to serve each man what he wished. So we'd call that an open bar today. During this party, Xerxes gets liquored up. The Bible calls it being high spirits from wine. So he's liquored up. He's showing off. He wants everybody to know what a big man he is. So he calls for Vashti to come in and show off, or he wants to show her off. And verse 11 says that Vashti is lovely to look at. It says, to bring before him Queen Vashti, wearing her royal crown in order to display her beauty to the people and nobles, for she was lovely to look at. Well, Vashti, she decides she's not too crazy about parading around in front of a bunch of drunk guys, so she doesn't go. Well, you can imagine how a king that is not used to being told no takes that. He doesn't take it well at all. He gets his advisors together, which are 7 eunuchs who advise Xerxes on matters of law and justice. Now, I'm sure you're asking yourself, what's the king doing asking 7 eunuchs to counsel him on a marital situation? Well, I don't know. Doesn't seem like a good idea, does it? But he does. And the eunuchs tell Xerxes that Vashti is making him look bad. They tell him that if all the women in Persia will disobey and disrespect their husbands, if Vashti gets away with this disobedience without punishment. So they tell him, King, it's not a good look. So as a matter of national security, Xerxes fires Vashti as queen. He's out of queen. He needs a new queen, so he goes on the hunt for a new woman. Now, chapter 2, verses 2 through 4 reads, Then the king's personal attendants proposed, Let a search be made for beautiful young virgins for the king. Let the king appoint commissioners in every province of his realm to bring all these beautiful girls to the harem at the citadel of Susa. Let them be placed under the care of Haggai, the king's eunuch, who is in charge of the women, and let beauty treatments be given to them. Then let the girl who pleases the king, be queen instead of Vashti. This advice appealed to the king, and he followed it. So the hunt begins. Esther is chosen as one of the bachelorettes. She's being raised by her cousin Mordecai. Her parents are now dead. Esther is the most beautiful and appealing of all the bachelorettes, and Xerxes chooses her as queen. Now, while this beauty pageant is going on, Mordecai hangs out at the king's gate. This is the gate that enters into the palace grounds, trying to catch word of how Esther's doing in the pageant. So Mordecai, while he's there at the king's gate, Mordecai overhears two of Xerxes' officers plotting to assassinate him. So he sends word to Esther. She tells the king and gives Mordecai the credit. So the plotting officers are hanged, and it's all recorded in the annals of the king. Now, sometime later, Xerxes elevates a guy named Haman to second in command of Persia. Haman is a self-important fellow. We'd likely describe him as being a legend in his own mind, and he hates Jews. Now, as I'd said before, Jews had been offered a lot of freedom. They had businesses, they had prospered, and there were a lot of them. But Haman didn't like them. He hated them. Now, Mordecai is still holding down his place at the king's gate, and every time Haman walks by, in and out of the palace, Mordecai doesn't bow. Now, the people are supposed to be bowing to Haman. He's second in command in the whole country, and he walks along, probably has tunnel vision. He's not looking around to see if everybody's bowing to him, but he's told Mordecai is not bowing, and all the citizens are required to do that. So Haman's upset about that, and he knows Mordecai is a Jew, and he tells Xerxes that the Jews are a dissident group and are not obeying Persian law. And he convinces Xerxes to sign a decree that on the 13th day of the 12th month, anybody can kill a Jew and plunder his property. Now, of course, Mordecai gets all worked up over this and sends words to Esther that she must beg the king for mercy. Now, let me read to you chapter 4, verses 9 through 17. Hathach went back and reported to Esther what Mordecai had said. Then she instructed him to say to Mordecai, "All the king's officials and the people of the royal provinces know that for any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned, the king has but one law, that he be put to death. The only exception to this is for the king to extend the gold scepter to him and spare his life. But 30 days have passed since I was called to go to the king." When Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, he sent back this answer: "Do not think that because you are in the king's house and alone of all the Jews, you will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance of the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to royal position for such a time as this." Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai: "Go gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my maids will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish." So Mordecai went away and carried out all Esther's instructions. Now, to back up, Esther can't just go knock on the king's door and say, "King, I need a word." Because if he doesn't want to see her, or anybody else for that matter, that person is executed. Now, she's got to wait out in the outer area to the throne room, and if the king calls her in, she's fine. Holds out his scepter. That means, come on in. But if he doesn't, she's not fine at all. Now on the 3rd day, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the palace in front of the king's hall. The king was sitting on his royal throne in the hall facing the entrance. When he saw Queen Esther standing in the court, he was pleased with her and held out to her the gold scepter that was in his hand. So, good so far. So Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. Then the king asked, "What is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom it will be given you." If it pleases the king, replied Esther, let the king together with Haman come today. See, she's setting this deal up. Come today to a banquet I have prepared for him. Bring Haman at once, the king said, so that we may do what Esther asked. So the king and Haman went to the banquet Esther had prepared. As they were drinking wine, the king again asked Esther, now what is your petition? It will be given you. And what is your request? Even up to half the kingdom it will be granted. Esther replied, my petition and my request is this. If the king regards me with favor, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition and fulfill my request, let the king and Haman come tomorrow to the banquet I will prepare for them. Then I will answer the king's question. Haman goes home, and he brags to his wife and his buddies about how he's being honored by the queen. But he can't be happy as long as Mordecai the Jew is alive, because on his way home from work, Haman passes Mordecai and he doesn't bow. So his wife and his friends tell him to have a gallows built 75 foot high and ask the king to hang Mordecai on it tomorrow. Now this is chapter 6. That night the king could not sleep, so he ordered the book of the Chronicles, the record of his reign, to be brought in and read to him. It was found, recorded there, that Mordecai had exposed Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's officers who guarded the doorway, who had conspired to assassinate King Xerxes. What honor and recognition has Mordecai received for this? The king asked. Nothing has been done for him, the attendants answered. The king said, well, who is in the court? Now Haman had just entered the outer court of the palace to speak to the king about hanging Mordecai on the gallows he had erected for him. His attendants answered, Haman is standing in the court. When Haman entered, the king asked him, what should be done for the man the king delights to honor? So Haman, he's thinking, well, the king wants to honor me. Let's think up something really good. So Haman says, well, who is there that the king would rather honor than me? So he answered the king, for the man the king delights to honor, have them bring a royal robe the king has worn and a horse the king has ridden, one with a royal crest placed on its head. Then let the robe and the horse be entrusted to one of the king's most noble princes. Let them robe the man the king delights to honor, and lead him on the horse through the city streets, proclaiming before him, this is what is done for the man the king delights to honor. Go at once, the king commanded Haman. Get the robe and the horse and do just as you have suggested for Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the king's gate. Do not neglect anything you have recommended. So Haman got the robe and the horse. He robed Mordecai, led him on horseback through the city streets, proclaiming before him, this is what is done for the man the king delights to honor. Afterward, Mordecai returned to the king's gate, but Haman rushed home with his head covered in grief and told Zeresh, his wife, and all his friends everything that had happened to him. His advisors and his wife said to him, since Mordecai, before whom your downfall has started, is of Jewish origin, you cannot stand against him. You will surely come to ruin. While they were still talking with him, the king's eunuchs arrived and hurried Haman away to the banquet Esther had prepared. So the king and Haman went to dine, this is chapter 7, went to dine with Queen Esther. And as they were drinking wine on that second day, the king again asked Queen Esther, what is your petition? It will be granted you. What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be granted. Then Queen Esther answered, if I have found favor with you, O king, and if it pleases your majesty, grant me my life, this is my petition, and spare my people, this is my request. For I and my people have been sold for destruction and slaughter and annihilation. If we had merely been sold as male and female slaves, I would have kept quiet, because no such distress would justify disturbing the king. King Xerxes asked Queen Esther, who is he? Where is the man who has dared to do such a thing? Esther said, The adversary and enemy is this vile Haman. Then Haman was terrified before the king and queen. The king got up in a rage, left his wine, and went out into the palace garden. But Haman, realizing that the king had already decided his fate, stayed behind to beg Queen Esther for his life. Just as the king returned from the palace garden to the banquet hall, Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was reclining. The king exclaimed, Will he even molest the queen while she is with me in the house? As soon as the word left the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. Then Harbona, one of the eunuchs attending the king, said, A gallows 75 feet high stands by Haman's house. He had it made for Mordecai, who spoke up to help the king. The king said, Hang him on it. So they hanged Haman on the gallows he had prepared for Mordecai. Then the king's fury subsided. Now, great story. Besides being very entertaining, what can we learn from it? Well, again, just like last week, when God put David in a situation where David could conquer Goliath for God's glory, God put Esther in a situation where she could overcome for God's glory. But just like David and Esther and all the other stories that we will learn about, God puts people in a situation. Now they have to decide whether they're going to capitalize on that situation for God's glory or not. And Esther did. And how did she do it? Well, she called upon Mordecai to gather the Jews up to fast and to pray. At the same time, she got her maids together, she fasted, and she prayed. And just like David and the stories that we will study in the future, God answered prayer. Now, for God to answer prayer, you got to pray, right? So, for us, difficult situations, we need to give to God. Now, please pray with me. Lord, we know you're always there. We know you're our God. We know you are the master and creator of all things. We know that Jesus is your son. You sent him to earth. He was crucified. You raised him from the dead. We give you all of our thanks and all of our glory, and we know that all things are possible in every situation. All things are possible with you. In Jesus' name, amen. See you next time.